Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome to Adventures in History. Today's topic is Ulysses S. Grant, Part 1, Humble Beginning in Ohio. Ulysses S. Grant was the 18th U.S. President. He was born in Point Pleasant, Ohio, which is on the Ohio River in southwestern Ohio near Cincinnati. He attended West Point and served in the Mexican War. He farmed near St. Louis, Missouri. He was a clerk in a tannery store in Galena, Illinois. He was the top U.S. general in the Civil War, elected president in 1868 and 1870, reelected in 1872, and served as U.S. president for 8 years from 1869 to 1877. He was named after the ancient Greek hero Ulysses, or Odysseus, who was the hero of Homer's novel, The Odyssey. He was very good with horses. He loved horses. His wife's name was Julia Dent. They had a very happy marriage and family life. He admired Zachary Taylor, who he knew during the Mexican War. At age 38, he was considered a failure. Then the Civil War came, and he became this major hero and Abraham Lincoln's top general. Some of the Union battles he served in included Shiloh and Vicksburg, among others. When he was elected president, it was the first time African Americans voted. He was beloved by black Americans, African Americans, for winning the Civil War and ending slavery and helping them to vote, at least for a while after the Civil War. 500,000 black Americans voted in 1868. There was corruption in his administration, as it was the beginning of the United States really becoming a rich country. Historian Ronald C. White wrote, quote, "Ulysses S. Grant was renowned for his ability to ride in gentle horses. But what do horse stories mean to a modern reader? In an earlier era, when horses were central to everyday life, people understood that the man whom horses trust is the kind of man who can be trusted." Ronald C. White continued, quote, "Ulysses S. Grant had a lifelong affair with Mexico. His involvement in the Mexican War is well known. More obscure but no less fascinating are his various efforts, both as general and president, to enlist American support for Mexico's aspirations to become a liberal democracy." Ronald C. White continued, quote, "The unrecognized person in Grant's faith story is John Hale Vincent, his Methodist pastor in Galena, Illinois, who went on to found the now famous Chautauqua Institute in New York in 1874, and summoned President Grant to participate there the following summer. Ulysses S. Grant was born on April 27, 1822, in Point Pleasant, Ohio, near Cincinnati. His parents were Jesse Grant and Hannah Grant. Hannah's stepmother admired the fictional ancient Greek hero Ulysses, or Odysseus, from the Odyssey, and she suggested the name Ulysses for the new baby, and the parents, Jesse and Hannah, agreed. So Ulysses S. Grant was named after Odysseus, the hero of the Odyssey. His birth name was Hiram Ulysses Grant. Now at West Point, the name submitted by the congressman was Ulysses S. Grant, who the congressman believed that his middle name was Simpson, his mother's maiden name. So the Army his name changed at West Point from Hiram Ulysses Grant, or HUG, to Ulysses S. Grant at West Point, and he protested for a while, but then he accepted the new name. As a boy, the boys taunted him with the nickname Useless Grant. Now, his father, Jesse, was very talkative, arrogant, and ambitious, and he fought people in business and politics and was very ambitious to become wealthy. Ulysses S. Grant's ancestors came from England and arrived in Dorchester, Massachusetts in 1630. Matthew and Priscilla Grant, who were Puritans. His father, Jesse, was very independent and determined to master the tanning business, which is horses' cow hides that could be turned into saddles and bridles for horse riding. His father lived in Kentucky, and when he was a younger fella, became anti-slavery, experienced slavery there. Moved to Ohio and worked in a tannery as a young man, owned by Owen Brown, the father of John Brown, the famous abolitionist. So he was exposed to anti-slavery ideas there in Point Pleasant, Ohio. In 1821, he married Hannah Simpson, who was quiet and subdued, very calm, kind of good person. And she was really the parent whom Ulysses emulated rather than his father, his mother. In 1823, Jesse Grant purchased a lot in Georgetown, Ohio. More children came: Simpson, Clara, Jenny, Orville, and Mary. Ulysses S. Grant disliked the stench from the tannery. Slavery was an incendiary topic during this time. Ohio was the first state in the Northwest Territory, and slavery was banned there in 1787. Georgetown was 10 miles from the Ohio River and Kentucky, and escaped slaves would pass by. And the town was split regarding slavery, those opposed and those who were in favor of it. And Ulysses' father, Jesse, was very much against slavery. Ulysses' parents, Jesse and Hannah, supported Andrew Jackson and the Democrats at that time. In 1830, Jesse ran for mayor of Georgetown and lost. He was elected mayor of the town in the late 1830s. As a child, Ulysses S. Grant was stoic and even-tempered. He was steady and serious. The family were Methodist Christians. There was no dancing, card playing, or cursing. When Ulysses S. Grant became angry, he might say thunder and lightning or darn. Ulysses S. Grant revered women. As a boy, he enjoyed swimming, marbles, ice skating, and barefoot fishing in the summer. He did not like hunting. Now, he would become angry when he saw bullies tormenting an innocent child or a defenseless horse. Smaller boys embraced Ulysses S. Grant, as their steadfast protector. If a boy picked on a smaller boy, Ulysses would intervene and say that he would fight the big boy. In school, he was quiet and studious. Ulysses enjoyed history, politics, and read a George Washington biography. He had a thirst for knowledge. As a child, his father, Jesse, overpowered him, and he came to resent his father's pressure. Stories from his childhood reveal the qualities of his character: patience, common sense, physical bravery, and a love of animals. Hunting was a very popular pastime for boys on the frontier in Ohio, hunting deer, turkeys, rabbits, and squirrels. However, Ulysses disliked hunting. He did not want to kill animals. So you can see this humane character. He was a very humane person. Ulysses developed an aversion for egotists and braggarts, probably because of his father's persona. He loved horses. He could escape the social complexities with horses. He loved riding them and developing relationships with them. He had the ability to break wild horses. Ulysses S. Grant said, quote, "If people knew how much more they could get out of a horse by gentleness than by harshness, they would save a great deal of trouble, both to the horse and the man." So he would be patient with horses and in training them, helping them to become domestic. When he was 8 years old, he had a business. He had 2 horses hauling logs for his father's business. At one point, his father wanted to buy a horse from a farmer, and he wanted to pay $20, and the farmer wanted $25, and he sent Ulysses to buy the horse, and Ulysses told the man, he said, quote, "Papa says I may offer you $20. If you won't accept that, I'll offer you $22.50. And if you won't accept that, to give $25. And so anyway, so the farmer heard this and obviously accepted the $25. And this story got around, and this was embarrassing for Ulysses. As a Grant, as a boy, the Grants had a farm along with the tannery, and Ulysses enjoyed farming, riding the horse, plowing crops, sawing wood, and milking cows. So he did farm work growing up. He did not like the hand tanning business. The hides would be soaked in a vat of lye solution, the hairs stripped off with knives. The floor of the tannery was slimy with blood and animal fat, and there were giant rats, and it really smelled bad. And he decided that he would not work in the tannery as an adult, but he did help as a child. By 1836, Ulysses was studying at a private school in Marysville, Kentucky, Marysville Seminary, and he joined the debate society and got involved in a debate, and Ulysses argued that intemperance or alcoholism was a greater threat than war. In 1837, there was a financial crisis, and Ulysses returned to Georgetown for a year. In 1838, he went to study at the Presbyterian Academy in Ripley, Ohio, run by Reverend John Rankin, who was anti-slavery and a conductor on the Underground Railroad, helping escape slaves to freedom in the North and Canada. And Harriet Beecher Stowe received material for her famous book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, from Rankin. 1838, Jesse, Ulysses' father, decided that Ulysses would attend West Point for college because it was free. He wrote to the local congressman, Thomas Hammer, asking him to nominate Ulysses as a candidate for West Point. And this is when Hammer got Grant's name wrong, and he wrote it as, instead of his real name, Hiram Ulysses Grant, he wrote Ulysses S. Grant, believing the S was for Simpson. And this is how Ulysses got the name changed. The Army would not accept his real name. May 15th, 1839, Ulysses left home for West Point. He was 17 years old. His mother, Hannah, asked him to promise that he would not use profane language at West Point. He traveled by steamboat to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and a canal boat to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, then a train to Philadelphia that had a maximum speed of 18 miles an hour. And then he was on the Hudson River to West Point. So on this trip to West Point, he was on this railroad from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and Grant remembered, quote, "We traveled at least 18 miles an hour when at full speed, and made the whole distance averaging probably as much as 12 miles an hour. I thought the perfection of rapid transit had been reached." When Ulysses reached Philadelphia, he spent 5 days there sightseeing and exploring, seeing the sights associated with the founding of the United States. At West Point, one of his fellow cadets was William Tecumseh Sherman, who became his top general and lifelong friends. And he gave, at West Point, Grant got his name became Ulysses S. Grant, or U.S. Grant. He got the nickname Uncle Sam or Sam, and he accepted this clerical error, his new name, Ulysses S. Grant. General Winfield Scott was there at that time reviewing the cadets. Now the enlistment, there was a free college, but after graduation, the men would have to serve in the U.S. Army for 8 years. During his time, he visited the house of Benedict Arnold, whom he called a base, heartless traitor. Ulysses received demerits for careless deportment, untied shoelaces, being late for drills. His fellow cadets commended him for his honesty, candor, and generosity. He was clear-headed, wanted to do the right thing, and was respected by his peers. No cooking was allowed in the rooms. However, one night, Ulysses roasted a chicken. An officer knocked on the door. Ulysses answered the door and was standing at attention, and the officer could smell the chicken that had been cooked, and he said, quote, "I've noticed it." And then the officer left and did not punish Grant. He decided maybe he liked him, so Ulysses got away with that. The most charismatic teacher at West Point was Antoine Henry Jomini, who admired Napoleon Bonaparte and talked about having a flexible supply basis and rapid movement of troops and concentration of forces. And these were ideas that Grant applied in the Civil War. Ulysses learned well the military campaigns of Napoleon Bonaparte, Frederick the Great, and Julius Caesar. Now, during this time, there was a debate in Congress about the possibility of abolishing West Point, and Grant hoped that it would happen so he could go home. Ulysses enjoyed literature, the works of Sir Walter Scott, Washington Irving, James Fenimore Cooper. At West Point, they taught drawing and battle map drawing. Ulysses excelled in horse riding. He had the ability to subdue unruly horses. He met many of the Confederate officers in the future and knew men who became Confederate officers, and this knowledge became useful for him trying to predict what they could do. Ulysses was known for his courage and energy at this time. After 2 years at West Point, he had a 2-month furlough to go home. Jesse had moved the family home from Georgetown, Ohio, to Bethel, Ohio, 12 miles away. In the 1840 campaign, when William Henry Harrison was elected president in the Tippecanoe and Tyler II campaign, Jesse campaigned for Harrison and pulled the oar in a large canoe on wheels. Jesse was elected mayor of Bethel within 10 years. Ulysses became lean and muscular at West Point, and seeing her son after 2 years, Hannah said, quote, "Ulysses, you have grown much straighter." And Grant said, quote, "Yes, that was the first thing they taught me." During his visit home, he developed a love interest in Kate Lowe from Batavia, Ohio, and wrote a poem for her. The quote went like this, quote, "Kindly then remember me. I'll also often think of thee, nor forget the soldier story, gone to gain the field of glory." So he returned to West Point for his final 2 years and received more demerits. He was confined to quarters for 2 weeks because he spoke disrespectfully to a superior officer, and he was depressed about that. The last 6 months he had a bad cough and lost weight. During this time, 2 of his uncles died of consumption. In June, Grant graduated from West Point. This was a happy time for him. He was stationed. His first place where he went was the Jefferson Barracks south of St. Louis, Missouri. He was a brevet second lieutenant. Grant was sensitive to ridicule. On the way, he was mocked by a poor boy in Cincinnati, Ohio, and that bothered him. At the Jefferson Barracks were the largest military outpost in the United States. They were built to protect settlers on the Great Plains from Indian attacks, and 200 Civil War generals spent time there. He reported in 1843 to the Jefferson Barracks on September 30th. Officers were invited to parties in St. Louis. He visited the home of his West Point roommate, Fred Dent, that was 5 miles away, and Fred had told his sister Julia, quote, "I want you to know Ulysses S. Grant. He is pure gold. I have never known him to use a profane or vulgar word. He is a splendid fellow." So Grant at this time had a pretty boy face that was not yet careworn from drink, depression, and business failure. Grant visited the Whitehaven, the Dent family home often. He never quite conformed to strict Army discipline. St. Louis was divided. Missouri was a slave state. There were a lot of German immigrants who were abolitionists. The Dents owned 13 slaves. They had a farm. They had cash crops that they grew, wheat, oats, corn, and potatoes. And they did well. And then later they had 30 slaves. February 1844, Grant met Julia Dent. She was 4 years younger. She enjoyed the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer, so they had that in common. Or at least that's whom Grant was named after, Odysseus or Ulysses. She also enjoyed the writing of Samuel Johnson, Lord Byron, and Victor Hugo. With Grant and Julia, it was love at first sight. They became inseparable. Julia was affectionate, and Grant yearned for affection because his mother was kind of austere and stoic. And now Julia saw in Grant that he was handsome, kind, honest, and brave. And Julia became the bedrock for Ulysses S. Grant's life. They had a very, very good marriage. And Julia always believed that Ulysses would succeed despite the failure he experienced. Now again, the Grant family was abolitionists. They were against slavery. Julia's family owned slaves, so you could see there was a conflict there. In the spring of 1844, Grant learned that his infantry unit was being shipped to Louisiana. Grant and Ulysses and Julia were secretly engaged to be married. And in May of 1844, Grant was at Camp Salubrity near Natchitoches in western Louisiana, near the Texas border, and he wrote letters to Julia with a drumhead desk. In the 1844 election, James K. Polk was elected, and he wanted the U.S. to take Texas. In 1844, Grant traveled from Austin, Texas, to Corpus Christi near Goliad, Texas, and he and his friends were hunting turkeys, and Grant remembered, quote, "We had scarcely reached the edge of the timber when I heard the flutter of wings overhead. In an instant I saw 2 or 3 turkeys flying away. These were soon followed by more, then more, and more, until a flock of 20 or 30 had left from just over my head. All this time I stood watching the turkeys to see where they flew, with my gun on my shoulder. I never once thought of leveling it at the birds. I came to the conclusion that as a sportsman I was a failure." In February of 1845, the United States annexed Texas, and war with Mexico was coming. Julia's father opposed the marriage of Ulysses and Julia. He agreed that they could correspond. He agreed that they could marry in a year or two. In September of 1845, Grant and his infantry regiment moved to Corpus Christi, Texas. Grant believed that the Mexicans preferred the U.S. government over the Mexican government. Zachary Taylor was the commander of the army there. And Grant wrote, quote, "There was no man living who I admired and respected more than General Zachary Taylor." In Corpus Christi, Grant led a team of men scraping oyster beds that were obstructing the passage of ships, and Grant jumped into the waist-high water to demonstrate the work that needed to be done. Grant's father, Jesse, wanted him to quit the Army and take an offer to be a math professor in Hillsboro, Ohio. January of 1846 in Corpus Christi, the Army created 2 theaters to help the men avoid debauchery. Grant's regiment was ordered to move to the Rio Grande opposite Matamoros, Mexico, where there was a large Mexican army and war was near. On April 12th, the Mexican general Pedro de Ampudia warned Zachary Taylor that he needed to leave and was risking war. Taylor would not move. 2 weeks later, the Mexicans attacked and the war started. Congress voted for war with Mexico. On May 8th, there was the Battle of Palo Alto, which was an artillery contest. Grant saw a man's skull shattered. Another man lost his underjaw, lost the ability to speak and eat. These were the horrors of war. May 18th was victory at Matamoros, and the army spent 3 months there. He thought often of Julia, his beloved. Grant respected the Mexican soldiers and believed that they had poor generals. Grant believed there was a need to be magnanimous in victory, that the poor Mexicans had been downtrodden by the wealthy. In Camargo, Mexico, Grant was the acting assistant quartermaster. He learned the logistics of feeding, clothing, and transporting an army, providing uniforms, shoes, canteens, blankets, tents, cooking utensils, horses, and mules, the nuts and bolts of the army, good training for the Civil War. On wooden campfires, they had cattle that was butchered for fresh meat. And there was this. At one point, he was involved, and they were moving, and he got these mules that were not very cooperative as pack mules. And Grant remembered, quote, "I am not aware of ever having used a profane expletive in my life, but I would have the charity to excuse those who may have done so if they were in charge of a train of Mexican pack mules at the time." In Monterrey, Mexico, the Mexicans had a strong position, more troops, thick stone walls. September 23, 1846, there was fighting. Grant rode a horse providing fresh supplies. He was fired on. It was a very dangerous thing he did, but it worked, and the Americans won a victory there. Ulysses S. Grant enjoyed Mexico. He loved foreign travel. He established a bakery, and he learned the politics of war as President James K. Polk was in conflict with General Zachary Taylor. Grant could see that Taylor was a victim of the political conflict with James K. Polk. Winfield Scott became the most important U.S. military person from the Revolution to the Civil War. He served from James Madison to Abraham Lincoln. He was the other Mexican General War. He was vain and enjoyed plumed hats and medals. Scott led the campaign from Veracruz to Mexico City, 12,000 men, 250 miles in the mountainous area. Very impressive. Some of the Civil War generals who were there, who were later Civil War generals, included Pierre G.T. Beauregard, George B. McClellan, Robert E. Lee, Joseph Hooker, and George Meade, all Civil War generals. February of 1847, Zachary Taylor achieved victory at Buena Vista, and that helped him become president in 1848. March 9th was the invasion at Veracruz, led by Winfield Scott. It was a walled city. There was a siege by artillery. March 29th, the Mexicans surrendered. 5,000 prisoners. Scott paroled those prisoners, and they could keep their sidearms and horses. This was a precedent that Grant learned that he applied in the Civil War. Paroling, that would be too hard to keep prisoners. And they needed to have the pork and beans rolled out. So, the Mexican War, victory at Buena Vista. Santa Anna retreated the Mexican general and left behind $30,000 in money and his wooden leg. In April of 1847, the march to Mexico City, living off the land. Now, this was put pressure on the quartermaster, Ulysses S. Grant. No mail to his parents. His mother's hair turned white during this time, worrying about his son. There was the Battle of Cerro Gordo. Robert E. Lee found a mountain trail and helped with an attack in the rear. And Grant called this Napoleon crossing the Alps. Victory there. 1,000 Mexican casualties. Grant learned important lessons here. The audacity, speed, momentum, and surprise in war. General Scott praised Robert E. Lee and promoted him. Santa Anna was leading the Mexican army. As we said, he escaped. They has left behind his carriage, $30,000 in gold, and his cork leg. The army arrived in Jalapa, which was there were mountains and snow-covered mountains, orange groves, and gardens. And Grant said it was, quote, the most beautiful place I ever saw in my life. General Winfield Scott and the army traveled the national highway to Mexico City. There were battles at Contreras, San Geronimo, and Churubusco. There were 1,000 American casualties, 4 times that for the Mexicans, who lost 1/3 of their army. The Battle of Molino del Rey, Grant showed bravery and compassion. He tended the wounded soldiers on the battlefield. He was called a ministering angel with a kind heart. He found George Pickett shivering in the cold, who said, quote, I shall freeze to death. Grant gave him a roasted red chili pepper and said, quote, here, Pickett, you eat this and it will be as good as a stove inside of you. September 12th, there was the attack of the fortress at Chapultepec. Grant saw a church steeple 100 feet high, and he thought, well, we could get artillery up there and use it to fire on the Mexicans. Grant knocked on the door of the church. The priest opened and said that Grant and his men could not enter. Grant remained polite and entered the church without permission. Grant and his men hoisted and dismantled the howitzer to the belfry and reassembled it there and fired it. It was effective, firing on the San Cosme Gate. Grant was promoted to brevet captain for that action. He was gallant and meritorious in the Battle of Chapultepec. Irvin McDowell said, quote, that Grant was the best horseman and the bravest fellow in the army. Winfield Scott said that Robert E. Lee was the best soldier he ever saw in the field. September 14th, General Scott was in the National Palace at Mexico City, the halls of Montezuma. Santa Anna had emptied the prisons. And so the war was coming to an end. Grant's friend Sidney Smith died during this time, during the war. Grant could see that the U.S. policy needed to be charitable toward the Mexicans to restore order and peace, which it was. So this thus began the occupation of Mexico and Mexico City. And the fighting came to an end, then the negotiating began. Grant played cards daily with Franklin Pierce, who became U.S. president. He could see the inequality in Mexico and sided with the poor. Grant said, quote, "With a soil and climate scarcely equaled in the world, Mexico has more poor and starving subjects who are willing and able to work than any country in the world. The rich keep down the poor with a hardness of heart that is incredible." There was bullfighting was the national sport of Mexico. Grant attended one bullfight. He did not like it. He identified with a dying bull. During this time, he ascended the volcanic mountain Popocatépetl and enjoyed that. Grant spent 10 months in Mexico after the war ended. It was a happy time for him. He pitied the Mexican people and said, quote, "Mexico has more poor and starving subjects who are willing and able to work than any country in the world. The rich keep down the poor with a hardness of heart that is incredible." Well, that concludes today's presentation. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. God bless you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.